The autumn mist clung to the rolling hills of Albemarle County like a shroud, obscuring the sprawling Henderson plantation from the main road. Samuel Henderson stood on the wraparound porch of his imposing colonial mansion, his weathered hands gripping the white-painted railing as he surveyed his domain. At 53, he cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-grey hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through a person's soul. The plantation stretched across nearly 800 acres of Virginia's fertile soil, worked by dozens of enslaved people who lived in the quarters beyond the main house. Cotton and tobacco fields extended as far as the eye could see, generating the wealth that had made the Henderson name synonymous with prosperity and respectability throughout the county. Samuel's wife, Margaret, emerged from the house carrying a silver tea service. At 45, she retained much of the beauty that had first caught Samuel's attention 25 years earlier, though her once bright green eyes now held a distant, haunted quality that visitors often mistook for spiritual contemplation. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the severe style befitting a preacher's wife, and her dark blue dress was modest yet elegant. "The children are ready for evening prayers," Margaret said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She set the tea service on the small table between two rocking chairs, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the delicate china cups. Samuel nodded approvingly. "Excellent. The Lord's work must never be delayed." He turned to face her, and Margaret instinctively lowered her gaze. "Have you prepared them properly?" "Yes, Samuel. They understand their duties." The Henderson children were the pride of the community, or so it appeared to outsiders. 17-year-old Ezekiel was tall and lean like his father, with the same penetrating blue eyes and an air of quiet intensity that made him seem older than his years. 15-year-old Rebecca possessed her mother's delicate features, but with her father's commanding presence, while 13-year-old Caleb was still growing into his lanky frame, his sandy hair falling across eyes that held an unsettling mixture of innocence and knowledge far beyond his years. The family's reputation in the community was impeccable. Samuel served as a lay preacher at the local Methodist church, delivering sermons that moved congregants to tears with their passionate descriptions of divine love and the importance of family unity. The Hendersons never missed a Sunday service, arriving in their finest clothes and sitting in the front pew, the very picture of Christian devotion. Neighbors often remarked on how well-behaved the Henderson children were, how they spoke only when spoken to and showed such remarkable respect for their parents. Other families held them up as examples to their own children, praising Samuel's firm but loving guidance. What the community didn't see were the evening gatherings that took place in the plantation's chapel, a small windowless building that Samuel had constructed behind the main house, claiming it was for private family worship. The structure was built of local fieldstone with heavy wooden doors that could be barred from the inside. Thick walls muffled any sounds that might escape during their spiritual exercises. As the sun set behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long shadows across the plantation grounds, the Henderson family gathered for their nightly ritual. Samuel led them down the gravel path to the chapel, carrying an ornate brass candlestick that had belonged to his grandfather. The flickering flame cast dancing shadows on their faces as they walked in solemn procession. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with the scent of burning candles and something else, something sweet and cloying that seemed to cling to the stone walls. Religious artifacts adorned every surface, crucifixes of various sizes, paintings depicting biblical scenes, and leather-bound volumes of scripture. But there were other items as well, objects that seemed out of place in a house of worship. Silk ropes, ornate chalices, and strange symbols carved into the wooden altar. Samuel took his position at the front of the chapel, his family arranged before him in order of age. The candlelight flickered across his face as he opened his worn Bible, the pages yellow with age and marked with countless annotations in his careful handwriting. "My beloved family," he began, his voice resonating in the small space. "We gather once again to demonstrate our complete devotion to the Almighty. As I have received in divine revelation, true communion with God requires the surrender of all earthly shame and the embrace of spiritual unity in its purest form." Margaret's hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. The children sat motionless, their eyes fixed on their father with a mixture of reverence and something that might have been fear. "Tonight, as always, we shall prove our faith through acts of sacred intimacy, showing the Lord that we hold nothing back from His divine will. Remember, my children, what we do here is holy work, blessed by God Himself and necessary for our salvation." As Samuel continued his sermon, his words took on an increasingly fervent quality, his eyes gleaming with religious ecstasy. Outside the chapel, the wind picked up, rattling the heavy wooden doors and causing the candle flames to dance wildly. The shadows on the walls seemed to writhe and twist, as if the very darkness was alive and watching. The plantation's enslaved workers had long since learned to avoid the area around the chapel during the evening hours. They whispered among themselves about the strange sounds that sometimes carried on the night wind, chanting, crying, and other noises they couldn't quite identify. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the candlelit windows, shadows that seemed to merge and separate in ways that defied explanation. But fear kept them silent, and the Henderson family's terrible secrets remained hidden behind the chapel's thick stone walls, protected by the facade of Christian respectability that Samuel had so carefully constructed. 3 months earlier, in the sweltering heat of a Virginia summer, Samuel Henderson had experienced what he would later describe as the most profound spiritual awakening of his life. It began during a particularly intense prayer session in his private study, a wood-paneled room lined with theological texts and religious artifacts collected over decades of devoted service. Samuel had been wrestling with what he perceived as spiritual stagnation in his family's faith. Despite their regular church attendance and daily prayers, he felt that they were merely going through the motions, failing to achieve the deep, transformative connection with the divine that he craved. As he knelt before a large wooden crucifix, sweat beading on his forehead in the oppressive heat, Samuel pleaded with God for guidance. That's when the vision came. In his fevered state, whether from the heat, exhaustion, or something else entirely, Samuel saw himself standing in a vast cathedral of light, surrounded by angelic figures whose faces were too brilliant to look upon directly. A voice, which he was certain belonged to God Himself, spoke to him with the force of thunder and the gentleness of a whisper. "Samuel, my faithful servant," the voice intoned, "you have been chosen to receive a sacred truth that has been hidden from the world. True communion with the divine requires the complete surrender of earthly shame and the embrace of spiritual unity in its most intimate form. Your family has been blessed to serve as vessels for this holy work." The vision continued, showing Samuel elaborate rituals involving his wife and children, acts that would have horrified any rational observer, but which, in his altered state, seemed suffused with divine light and purpose. He saw himself as a new Abraham, called to demonstrate his faith through ultimate sacrifice and obedience, but instead of offering his son's life, he was to offer something far more precious: the complete spiritual and physical surrender of his entire family. When Samuel emerged from his study hours later, his eyes held a new intensity that Margaret noticed immediately. He spoke to her in hushed, reverent tones about his revelation, describing it as a calling that would elevate their family above all others in God's eyes. Margaret, who had been raised to submit unquestioningly to her husband's spiritual authority, listened with growing unease, but dared not voice her doubts. "The Lord has shown me the path to true holiness," Samuel explained, as they sat in their bedroom that night, the summer heat making the air thick and oppressive. "We have been living as mere Christians when we could be living as saints, But it requires complete trust, complete surrender to his will. Margaret's hands trembled as she brushed her hair, watching her husband's reflection in the vanity mirror. What? What does the Lord require of us, Samuel? Samuel's eyes gleamed in the lamplight as he described the rituals he had seen in his vision. He spoke of sacred ceremonies that would bind the family together in ways that transcended earthly understanding, of acts of intimacy that would demonstrate their complete devotion to God's will. As he talked, his voice took on the same fervent quality that made his sermons so compelling, weaving together biblical passages and theological concepts to create a framework that made his demands seem not only reasonable, but necessary for salvation. "Think of it, Margaret," he said, his hand resting on her shoulder with gentle but firm pressure. Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac. Job endured every trial God placed before him. Are we to be less devoted than they? Are we to hold back any part of ourselves from the Lord's service? Over the following weeks, Samuel began to implement his new understanding of divine will. He started with small changes, longer prayer sessions, more intense Bible study, and the construction of the private chapel where the family could worship without the distractions of the outside world. He spoke to each family member individually, explaining their special calling and the importance of absolute obedience to God's plan. Ezekiel, as the eldest son, was the first to be fully initiated into Samuel's new theology. The 17-year-old had always been eager to please his father and prove his spiritual maturity. When Samuel explained that God had chosen their family for a special mission, Ezekiel accepted it without question, his young mind unable to fully grasp the implications of what was being asked of him. "You are to be my lieutenant in this holy work," Samuel told his son during one of their private conversations in the chapel. "The Lord has shown me that you have a crucial role to play in our family's spiritual elevation. Are you prepared to serve God with complete devotion?" "Yes, Father," Ezekiel replied, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes. "I want to serve the Lord as you do." Rebekah and Caleb were brought into the fold more gradually, with Samuel carefully explaining how their participation was essential to the family's salvation. He used their natural desire to please their parents and their fear of divine punishment to overcome any resistance they might have felt. The first ritual took place on a humid August night, with the family gathered in the candle-lit chapel. Samuel had spent hours preparing, arranging the space according to the specifications he claimed to have received in his vision. Silk ropes hung from hooks embedded in the stone walls, and the altar was covered with a white cloth embroidered with symbols that Samuel said represented divine love and unity. As the ceremony began, Samuel's voice filled the small space with prayers and incantations that seemed to blend traditional Christian liturgy with something far older and more disturbing. The candlelight flickered across the faces of his family members, revealing expressions of confusion, fear, and reluctant acceptance. "Remember," Samuel intoned as he began to remove his clothing, "what we do here is sacred. We are following in the footsteps of the patriarchs and prophets, demonstrating our faith through complete surrender to God's will." Margaret closed her eyes tightly as her husband's hands began to move over her body, his touch accompanied by whispered prayers and biblical quotations. The children watched with wide eyes, their young minds struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they had been taught about propriety and morality. But Samuel's conviction was absolute, his certainty so complete that it seemed to fill the chapel with its own dark energy. He had convinced himself so thoroughly that he was doing God's work that his family found themselves swept along by his fervor, unable to resist the force of his religious authority. As the night wore on and the rituals became increasingly disturbing, the candles burned lower, casting longer shadows on the chapel walls. Outside, the summer storm that had been building all day finally broke, sending rain hammering against the stone walls and wind howling through the trees. But inside the chapel, The Henderson family continued their worship, bound together by Samuel's twisted interpretation of divine will and their own inability to escape the web of religious manipulation he had woven around them. The plantation's enslaved workers, huddled in their quarters against the storm, heard strange sounds carried on the wind, sounds that made them pull their blankets tighter and whisper prayers of their own, asking for protection from whatever evil had taken root in the big house. By the winter of 1850, the Henderson plantation had become a place of whispered rumors and growing unease among the local community. What had begun as Samuel's private revelations had gradually expanded into something far more sinister, as his twisted theology demanded ever greater demonstrations of faith from his family and eventually from others. The first outsider to be drawn into Samuel's web was Thomas Whitmore, a young traveling preacher who had arrived at the plantation seeking shelter during a particularly harsh December snowstorm. Thomas was 26 years old, earnest and devout, with the kind of innocent faith that Samuel recognized as both admirable and exploitable. "Brother Thomas," Samuel said as they sat before the fireplace in the main house's parlor, the wind howling outside and snow piling against the windows, "I can see that the Lord has sent you to us for a purpose. You have the look of a man who truly seeks to know God's will." Thomas, grateful for the warm shelter and impressed by Samuel's reputation as a man of God, nodded eagerly. "I've heard of your devotion, Brother Henderson. The entire county speaks of your family's righteousness." Samuel's eyes gleamed in the firelight as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "What if I told you that there are depths of spiritual truth that most Christians never discover? That God has revealed to me practices that can bring a believer into direct communion with the divine?" Over the course of several days, as the storm raged outside and Thomas remained trapped at the plantation, Samuel gradually introduced him to his theological innovations. He spoke of ancient Christian mystics who had practiced forms of worship that the modern church had forgotten, of secret knowledge that had been passed down through generations of truly devoted believers. Thomas, young and impressionable, found himself drawn into Samuel's charismatic explanations. The older man's certainty was infectious, his biblical knowledge impressive, and his ability to weave together scripture and mystical concepts seemed to open new vistas of spiritual understanding. "The body is a temple," Samuel explained during one of their late-night theological discussions, "and like any temple, it must be consecrated through proper ritual. The early Christians understood this, but the church has become corrupted by worldly concerns and false modesty." When the storm finally passed and the roads became passable again, Thomas chose to remain at the plantation. Samuel had convinced him that he was on the verge of a spiritual breakthrough that would transform his ministry and bring him closer to God than he had ever imagined possible. The first spiritual exercise involving Thomas took place in the chapel on a cold January night. Samuel had prepared him carefully, explaining that what they were about to do was a sacred initiation that would open his eyes to divine truth. The young preacher, nervous but trusting, allowed himself to be led into the candlelit space where the Henderson family waited. What followed was a carefully orchestrated ritual that began with prayers and hymns, but gradually descended into acts that would have horrified any rational observer. Samuel's ability to frame even the most disturbing behavior in religious terms was masterful, and Thomas found himself swept along by the older man's conviction and the strange, hypnotic atmosphere of the chapel. Margaret watched from her position near the altar, her face a mask of resigned acceptance. She had long since stopped questioning her husband's interpretations of God's will, her spirit broken by months of psychological manipulation and religious coercion. The children, now fully indoctrinated into their father's twisted theology, participated with the mechanical obedience of those who had been thoroughly conditioned to submit. As winter gave way to spring, Thomas became a permanent resident of the plantation, his own ministry abandoned in favor of what Samuel called the deeper work. He helped Samuel recruit other visitors, using his youthful enthusiasm and apparent sincerity to draw unsuspecting travelers into their web. The plantation's enslaved population began to notice changes in the behavior of the white family and their guests. Strange processions moved between the main house and the chapel at all hours of the night. Visitors who arrived full of life and purpose seemed to become hollow-eyed and subdued after spending time with the Hendersons. Some guests disappeared entirely, their belongings left behind in their rooms as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Jeremiah, an elderly enslaved man who worked as the plantation's blacksmith, was among the first to piece together the truth about what was happening in the chapel. His quarters were close enough to the stone building that he could sometimes hear sounds that made his blood run cold, chanting, crying, and other noises that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. "Something evil done taken root in that place," he whispered to his wife Sarah as they lay in their small cabin one night, listening to the distant sounds of another spiritual exercise. "Master Samuel, he ain't right in the head no more. That whole family, they's cursed." Sarah nodded grimly, pulling their thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I seen things," she said quietly. "Seen them white folks coming and going from that chapel, and they don't look like the same people when they come out. Look like something been sucked right out of them." The enslaved community developed their own protective rituals, hanging iron nails and pieces of blessed cloth around their quarters, whispering prayers and singing spirituals to ward off whatever darkness had infected the plantation. They knew better than to speak openly about what they suspected, but they watched and waited, hoping that someone would eventually put a stop to the horror that was growing in their midst. Meanwhile, Samuel's influence continued to expand. He began hosting spiritual retreats for select members of the local religious community, carefully choosing individuals who seemed susceptible to his particular brand of theological manipulation. These gatherings, which he called gatherings of the faithful, took place over long weekends and involved increasingly elaborate rituals that pushed the boundaries of what his guests would accept in the name of spiritual growth. Dr. Edmund Carstairs, a respected physician from Charlottesville, was among those who attended these retreats. A widower in his 50s with a reputation for both medical skill and religious devotion, Dr. Carstairs had been struggling with depression following his wife's death from consumption. Samuel recognized his vulnerability and targeted him specifically, using his grief and spiritual hunger to draw him into the plantation's dark orbit. "Brother Edmund," Samuel said during one of their private conversations, "I can see that you carry a great burden. The Lord has shown me that your wife's death was not a tragedy, but a calling, a summons to deeper understanding of the mysteries of life and death." Dr. Carstairs, desperate for any explanation that might give meaning to his loss, found himself drawn to Samuel's words. The plantation owner's ability to weave together medical knowledge, theological concepts, and mystical ideas created a framework that seemed to offer both comfort and purpose. As spring turned to summer, the gatherings of the faithful became more frequent and more extreme. Samuel had created a core group of devoted followers who helped him recruit new participants and maintain the secrecy that was essential to their continued operation. The chapel was expanded with additional rooms and chambers, creating a complex that could accommodate larger groups and more elaborate rituals. But with growth came increased risk. The disappearances were becoming harder to explain, and some members of the local community were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the Henderson plantation and its mysterious guests. Samuel knew that he would need to be more careful, more selective in his recruitment if he wanted to continue his holy work without attracting unwanted attention from the authorities. The summer of 1851 would prove to be the beginning of the end for Samuel Henderson and his twisted vision of divine worship. But for now, as the heat of July settled over the Virginia countryside, the plantation continued to serve as a beacon for those seeking spiritual truth, drawing them into a web of corruption and horror that would ultimately consume everything it touched. The first crack in Samuel Henderson's carefully constructed facade appeared in late July 1851, when Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood arrived at the plantation seeking news of her missing son. Jonathan Blackwood, a 23-year-old seminary student, had been traveling through Virginia on his way to a missionary posting in the Western Territories when he had stopped at the Henderson plantation 3 weeks earlier. He had written to his mother about his intention to spend a few days studying with the renowned lay preacher Samuel Henderson, but no word had come from him since. Mrs. Blackwood was a formidable woman in her 50s, the widow of a prominent Richmond banker and a pillar of her local Methodist congregation. She had raised Jonathan alone after her husband's death, and her maternal instincts told her that something was terribly wrong. When her letters to the plantation went unanswered, she decided to make the journey herself, accompanied by her late husband's business partner, Mr. Charles Whitfield, and a hired driver. Samuel met them at the front door of the main house, his usual charming demeanor intact, but with an underlying tension that Mrs. Blackwood noticed immediately. He was dressed in his finest black suit, his silver hair carefully combed, and his blue eyes held their customary intensity, but there was something different about him, a nervous energy that seemed barely contained. "Mrs. Blackwood," Samuel said, extending his hand in greeting, "what an unexpected pleasure. I'm afraid I haven't received any correspondence from you, or I would have prepared a proper welcome." "Mr. Henderson," Mrs. Blackwood replied, her voice crisp and businesslike, "I've come seeking information about my son, Jonathan. He wrote to me 3 weeks ago saying he intended to spend time studying with you, but I've heard nothing since. I'm quite concerned." Samuel's expression remained carefully neutral, but Mrs. Blackwood caught a flicker of something, fear, guilt, in his eyes before he composed himself. "Jonathan Blackwood. Yes, of course. A fine young man, very devout. I'm afraid he left us nearly 2 weeks ago, continuing on his journey west. Perhaps his letters have been delayed by the unreliable postal service in these rural areas." But Mrs. Blackwood was not easily deceived. She had spent years managing her late husband's business affairs and had developed a keen ability to detect deception. Something in Samuel's manner, the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers, the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke her son's name, told her that he was lying. "I see," she said carefully. "Would it be possible for me to speak with your family? Perhaps they remember something about Jonathan's departure that might help me understand his current whereabouts." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid my wife is indisposed at the moment and the children are attending to their studies. Perhaps you could return another time when—" "Mr. Henderson," Mr. Whitfield interjected, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting answers. "Mrs. Blackwood has traveled a considerable distance to find her son. Surely your family could spare a few moments to assist in such an important matter." The tension in the air was palpable as Samuel weighed his options. He knew that turning away such respectable visitors would only increase suspicion, but he also knew that his family was in no condition to face questioning. The previous night's spiritual exercise had been particularly intense, and Margaret was still recovering from what Samuel euphemistically called her divine communion. "Of course," Samuel said finally, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Please, come in. I'll see if I can gather the family." As they entered the main house, Mrs. Blackwood's sharp eyes took in every detail. The furnishings were expensive and well-maintained. The religious artwork was tasteful and appropriate, but there was something oppressive about the atmosphere, a heaviness that seemed to press down on her shoulders like a physical weight. Margaret Henderson appeared in the parlor doorway a few minutes later, and Mrs. Blackwood was shocked by her appearance. The woman she remembered from church gatherings had been vibrant and engaging, but the person before her now seemed like a hollow shell. Margaret's green eyes were dull and unfocused, her auburn hair was disheveled despite obvious attempts to arrange it properly, and her hands shook as she smoothed her dark dress. "Mrs. Blackwood," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. How nice to see you." "Margaret, dear," Mrs. Blackwood replied, studying the other woman's face with growing alarm. "Are you quite well? You look rather pale." Margaret's eyes darted nervously to her husband before she answered. "I'm fine, just a bit tired. We've been very busy with our spiritual studies lately." The children appeared next, Ezekiel, Rebecca, and Caleb, and Mrs. Blackwood was equally disturbed by their appearance. All three had the same hollow-eyed look as their mother, and they moved with a strange mechanical quality that reminded her of sleepwalkers. When she asked them about Jonathan, they responded in monotone voices, reciting what were obviously rehearsed answers about his departure and their hope that he had reached his destination safely. But it was young Caleb who provided the first real clue that something was terribly wrong. As the family sat in the parlor making stilted conversation, the 13-year-old suddenly spoke up, his voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a knife. "He didn't want to leave," Caleb said suddenly, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the parlor window. "He kept saying he wanted to go home to his mother, but Father said the Lord's work wasn't finished." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel's face went white, then red, with barely controlled rage. Margaret let out a small, strangled sound, and Ezekiel and Rebecca stared at their younger brother with expressions of horror. "Caleb," Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you're confused, son. You're thinking of someone else." But the damage was done. Mrs. Blackwood's maternal instincts, already on high alert, now screamed that her son was in terrible danger, or worse. She exchanged a meaningful glance with Mr. Whitfield, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Henderson," Mrs. Blackwood said, rising from her chair with dignity, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. Perhaps you could show us the room where Jonathan stayed. I'd like to collect any belongings he might have left behind." Samuel's composure was cracking visibly now. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the relatively cool temperature in the parlor, and his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. The room has already been cleaned and prepared for other guests." "Then perhaps," Mr. Whitfield said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "we should speak with some of your other household members. Surely the servants would remember a guest who stayed for several weeks." The mention of the enslaved workers seemed to galvanize Samuel into action. He knew that Jeremiah and the others had seen and heard things that could destroy him if they were questioned by outsiders. His mind raced as he tried to find a way to get rid of his unwelcome visitors without arousing further suspicion. "I'm afraid I must ask you to leave," Samuel said abruptly, abandoning all pretense of hospitality. "You're upsetting my family with these accusations, and I won't have it in my home." Mrs. Blackwood stood her ground, her years of dealing with difficult business associates serving her well. "Mr. Henderson, I'm not leaving this plantation until I know what happened to my son. If you won't cooperate, I'll be forced to involve the authorities." The threat of outside intervention was exactly what Samuel had been dreading. He knew that any serious investigation would uncover evidence of his activities, evidence that would not only destroy his reputation, but likely result in criminal charges. His mind raced as he tried to calculate his options, but he was trapped between his need to maintain secrecy and the growing suspicion of his visitors. As the confrontation in the parlor intensified, none of them noticed the small figure pressed against the window outside. Thomas Whitmore, the young preacher who had become Samuel's first convert, had been listening to the conversation from the garden. The mention of Jonathan Blackwood's name had triggered memories that Samuel's psychological conditioning had tried to suppress. memories of what had really happened to the earnest young seminary student. Thomas remembered the night 3 weeks ago when Jonathan had finally broken under the pressure of Samuel's spiritual exercises. The young man had tried to flee the plantation, running through the darkness toward the main road, but Samuel and Ezekiel had caught him before he could escape. What followed had been swift and brutal, justified by Samuel as necessary to protect their holy work from those who couldn't understand its divine purpose. As Thomas stood in the garden, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had witnessed and participated in, he realized that he was standing at a crossroads. He could continue to follow Samuel's twisted path, or he could find the courage to speak the truth and perhaps save others from the fate that had befallen Jonathan Blackwood. Inside the house, the confrontation was reaching a breaking point. Mrs. Blackwood's determination was unwavering. Mr. Whitfield was growing increasingly suspicious, and Samuel was running out of options. The carefully constructed world he had built around his family and followers was beginning to crumble, and he knew that desperate measures would soon be necessary to preserve what remained of his dark kingdom. The summer afternoon sun was beginning to set over the Virginia hills, casting long shadows across the plantation grounds. In a few hours, darkness would fall, and with it would come the final terrible chapter in the story of the Henderson family and their horrific practices. As darkness fell over the Henderson plantation on that fateful July evening, the confrontation in the main house had reached a dangerous impasse. Mrs. Blackwood and Mr. Whitfield had refused to leave without answers about Jonathan's disappearance, while Samuel Henderson grew increasingly desperate to protect the secrets that could destroy everything he had built. The breaking point came when Thomas Whitmore finally found the courage to act on his conscience. As the household prepared for what Samuel had ominously declared would be a special spiritual exercise to deal with their unwelcome visitors, Thomas slipped away from the chapel and made his way to the quarters where the enslaved workers lived. He found Jeremiah in his small cabin, the elderly blacksmith sitting by a meager fire with his wife Sarah. The old man looked up with surprise and wariness as the young white preacher entered uninvited, but Thomas's obvious distress and the tears streaming down his face gave Jeremiah pause. "Please," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I need your help. People are going to die tonight if we don't do something." Jeremiah studied the young man's face in the firelight, seeing genuine terror and remorse in his eyes. "What are you talking about, boy? What's got you so scared?" Thomas's words came out in a rush as he described the horrors he had witnessed and participated in over the past months. He told Jeremiah about Jonathan Blackwood's murder, about the other visitors who had disappeared, about the twisted rituals that Samuel justified as divine worship. As he spoke, Sarah covered her mouth in horror, while Jeremiah's expression grew darker with each revelation. "Lord, have mercy," Jeremiah breathed when Thomas finished his confession. "We knew something evil was happening in that chapel, but this is worse than we ever imagined. Samuel's planning something terrible for tonight," Thomas continued urgently. "He can't let Mrs. Blackwood leave alive, not when she's asking so many questions. He's convinced himself that God wants him to silence anyone who threatens his holy work." Jeremiah stood up slowly, his weathered hands clenching into fists. He had endured decades of bondage and brutality, but the thought of innocent people being murdered in the name of religion filled him with a righteous anger that overcame his fear. "What you want us to do?" he asked quietly. Thomas had been thinking about this during his desperate walk to the quarters. "There's a way to stop this, but it's dangerous. Samuel keeps detailed records of everything, journals, lists of names, evidence of what he's done. If we can get those documents to the authorities, it will be enough to convict him. But first, we need to get Mrs. Blackwood and Mr. Whitfield away from here safely." Meanwhile, in the main house, Samuel was putting his final plan into motion. He had convinced himself that Mrs. Blackwood and her companion were agents of Satan, sent to test his faith and destroy his holy mission. In his twisted theology, their elimination was not murder, but divine justice, a necessary sacrifice to protect God's chosen work. He had drugged the evening tea that Margaret served to their guests, using a combination of laudanum and other substances that Dr. Carstairs had provided during one of his visits. Mrs. Blackwood and Mr. Whitfield were now unconscious in the parlor, their bodies limp in their chairs, as Samuel and his family prepared to transport them to the chapel for what he called their final purification. But as Samuel and Ezekiel carried the unconscious visitors toward the stone building, they were met by an unexpected sight. Thomas Whitmore stood in the chapel doorway, but he was not alone. Behind him were Jeremiah and several other enslaved workers, their faces grim with determination. "It's over, Samuel," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I won't let you hurt anyone else." Samuel's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You dare to betray the Lord's work? You who have been blessed with divine revelation?" "There's nothing divine about what you've done," Thomas replied. "You've twisted God's word to justify evil, and I was a fool to believe you. But I won't be a fool anymore." The confrontation that followed was brief but violent. Samuel, driven by religious mania and desperation, attacked Thomas with a fury that seemed almost inhuman. But Jeremiah and the other workers quickly overpowered the plantation owner, their years of suppressed anger finally finding an outlet. As Samuel was subdued, Jeremiah sent one of the younger men to ride to Charlottesville and alert the authorities. But they all knew that it would be hours before help arrived, and Samuel's followers, including his own family, were still dangerous. It was Margaret Henderson who provided the final tragic twist to the evening's events. As her husband was being restrained and the full horror of their situation became clear, something inside her mind finally snapped. The months of psychological abuse, religious manipulation, and forced participation in unspeakable acts had pushed her beyond the breaking point. With a scream that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, Margaret ran into the chapel and began overturning candles, setting fire to the silk hangings and wooden furnishings. The flames spread quickly through the dry wood and fabric, and within minutes the entire structure was engulfed in an inferno that lit up the night sky. "Let it all burn," Margaret shrieked, as the fire consumed the place where so much evil had been done. "Let God's judgment fall on this cursed place." The fire spread from the chapel to the main house with terrifying speed, driven by the summer wind and fed by the dry wooden structures. Samuel's screams of rage turned to cries of despair as he watched his empire of corruption being consumed by flames. His children, freed from his psychological control by the chaos around them, fled into the night with the other survivors. Thomas Whitmore managed to carry Mrs. Blackwood and Mr. Whitfield to safety as the plantation burned around them. The drugged visitors were beginning to regain consciousness, confused and disoriented, but alive. As they watched the flames consume the Henderson estate, Thomas told them the truth about what had happened to Jonathan Blackwood and the other victims of Samuel's twisted faith. When the authorities arrived the next morning, they found a scene of complete devastation. The main house and chapel were reduced to smoldering ruins, and Samuel Henderson's body was discovered in the wreckage, apparently killed when a burning beam fell on him as he tried to save his precious journals and artifacts. The investigation that followed uncovered evidence that shocked even hardened law enforcement officials. In the ruins of the chapel, they found charred human remains that were eventually identified as belonging to Jonathan Blackwood and at least 3 other missing persons. Samuel's partially burned journals, recovered from the ruins of his study, contained detailed accounts of the rituals and murders that had taken place on the plantation. Margaret Henderson survived the fire, but was found the next morning wandering the burned grounds in a state of complete mental collapse. She was committed to an asylum in Richmond, where she spent the remaining years of her life in silence, never speaking of the horrors she had endured and participated in. The Henderson children were taken in by relatives in other states, their names changed to protect them from the scandal that engulfed their family. Thomas Whitmore, racked with guilt over his participation in Samuel's crimes, devoted the rest of his life to missionary work among the poor, seeking redemption for his sins through service to others. Jeremiah and the other enslaved workers who had helped expose the truth were quietly freed and given passage to northern states, their heroic actions recognized by abolitionists who helped them start new lives. Jeremiah lived to see the end of slavery and often spoke to church groups about the night he helped bring down a false prophet who had used religion to justify unspeakable evil. The Henderson plantation was never rebuilt. The land was eventually sold to pay the family's debts, but no one would live there. Local residents reported strange phenomena for years afterward: unexplained lights in the ruins, the sound of chanting carried on the wind, and an oppressive feeling that seemed to hang over the entire property. By the time the Civil War began a decade later, the Henderson plantation had become a cautionary tale told throughout Virginia and beyond. It served as a reminder that evil could hide behind the mask of righteousness, and that the greatest horrors were often committed by those who claimed to act in God's name. The ruins of the chapel still stand today, overgrown with vines and slowly crumbling back into the earth. Local historians have documented the site, and it serves as a sobering reminder of how religious extremism and unchecked authority can lead to unimaginable tragedy. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood never fully recovered from the loss of her son, but she found some measure of peace in knowing that his death had not been in vain. The exposure of Samuel Henderson's crimes led to increased scrutiny of isolated religious communities and helped prevent similar tragedies from occurring elsewhere. The story of the Henderson family became a dark chapter in Virginia's history, a tale of how faith corrupted by power and isolation could transform a respected family into monsters. It stands as a testament to the courage of those who risked everything to expose the truth and bring justice to the victims of Samuel Henderson's horrific interpretation of divine will. In the end, the flames that consumed the Henderson plantation served as both destruction and purification, cleansing the land of the evil that had taken root there and ensuring that the victims of Samuel's twisted theology would not be forgotten. The truth, no matter how terrible, had finally been revealed, and justice, though delayed, had ultimately prevailed.